Ambassador Pillai will be chairing the session, and I now hand over the session. Over to him.
As I mentioned, we have a few questions in hand from the scholars, but maybe I should start with opening to the House first to see whether there are some urgent questions that you have in your mind, and then we will get the panelists to respond, and each of the remarks will be, the final say will come from the author. That's the chair. So, questions? No? Okay. Then I will have to read through with bad lights. Oh, you have a question? Yes.
Just to start the...
Yes.
Excellent presentations. I haven't had the occasion to read the book yet. But it's just a thought, and this is derived from the initial comments made by Chairman and Professor Muni. By the way, Professor Muni is someone I have known and admired for a long time. Together, we have known each other for 30 years, back to the times when we were in Canberra many years ago. Anyway, the point is, Professor Muni has, I presumably, argued in the book that India had always looked throughout antiquity towards the East, and that too with the modicum of reason. Of course, there were all kinds of linkages with the East. So today, when in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs they talk of look East or act East, how is it any different from what has always traditionally been the case? And secondly, having been in a sort of a policy-making system myself, there are often enough catchphrases in ministries, phrases like look East, act East, etc. But when push comes to shove, ministries or policymakers who deal with foreign affairs cannot afford to look just at one geographic direction. First of all, policies are not made that way. These are not geographically oriented. There are thematic issues. These issues have to be calibrated all around, organized in a way. So to use such catchphrases could be for advisors to political leaders, urging them to use expressions which are rhetorical redundants, because these do not actually exist when the policies are formulated and executed. Just some comments from
Yes, start this.
It's more directly.
Well, but he can comment last.
Yeah.
I thought the panelists talk first.
No, I think firstly I want to commend the author for the book because I don't think we have had enough literature on the whole India's engagement, whether it is a historic one or of the more recent one. So I would say that the more the merrier, and it's really, I'm so glad that Professor Muni has really taken the initiative to take a fresh look. In fact, before we started, Ambassador Chakman was saying that, look, he had written a book too, and that much has happened in the last few years, and I think the need to totalize becomes important, as well as to ask the question that Professor Muni is asking, which is, who was responsible? I mean, since the argument that India ignored the region. So I think to go back and keep looking at these arguments as a postmortem is useful. But of course, the book doesn't stop at a postmortem, but also looks at what the next steps are. So my own sense is that irrespective of what we call it, structurally, the logic of a globalized economy, the size of Indian economy, ASEAN today is the 6th largest economy. I mean, by just sheer total numbers, if India is 5th, in nominal terms, ASEAN is the 6th. So I would say proximity and the size will continue to force them together. Whether we do it kicking and screaming, or we do it smartly by active engagement, that might be different. But I think we are condemned to do more. And I think in the process, it is a job of our people like us, the academics and policy researchers, to show the limitations of the current and to point to how this can be bettered to realize the full potential of the relationship.
Okay. Firstly, let me compliment Professor Muni. I've been waiting for a long time for somebody to update Nilakanta Sastry, Professor Majmudar, and that's kind of scholarship. So today we have an update of the scholarship of those great historians. That's the first point. Secondly, I think this comes at a time when there is greater interest in India and Indian affairs, not only in this region but globally. So again, it's a very timely book. To answer my friend's question, two things. One, benign neglect. India's policy towards Southeast Asia was one of benign neglect, because we were not very prosperous, we were not a power to be reckoned with, we were not somebody who is on the world stage. So they were left us. Benign neglect of the Indian communities in Southeast Asia was very profound, because unlike the Chinese, who continued with the relationship with the Chinese communities in Southeast Asia, we didn't have that. It was only after Prime Minister Narasimha Rao's rookie speech, then India began to sit up and say, there is a constituency that is worth looking, that has got economic potential, that has got strategic potential. And then that is married with ASEAN. ASEAN was dismissed in those very famous words, puppets of Coca-Cola imperialism. And when India was asked to be a member, she turned us down, so to speak. Things changed. ASEAN began to be a cohesive body and was able to hold its own against anybody. And then, of course, we know the Afghan issue, the Cambodian issue. But so we now come to the present, where there is a healthy respect for each other, a healthy respect on the part of India towards Southeast Asia, and a healthy respect from Southeast Asia. That is why the last Indian Independence Day, all the 10 prime ministers were invited for National Day. So this is the kind of symbols and significance that is now marking the new relationship between India and Southeast Asia.
The way the program has been organized is to have the panelists say a few words on their own and then the question and answers. I decided I'll skip the opening statements from the panelists. I thought it's better that we cover as many questions as possible. So I've come to this. So let's proceed on that basis. We have two panelists who have given their views in the answer to Dr. Chowdhury's question. Maybe.
Thank you, Dr. Chaudhary. The basic thrust of your question is that why there is a change in the name, if I got it correct, that the foreign ministries do various things through various considerations, and who would know it better than you as to how the foreign ministries are run and what their priorities are. But the name change in case of from Look East to Act East, in my mind, and we have put it down thanks to my co-author, we have worked together and put it down with whatever little we could gather, is no substantial change. It is a change of appearances. It is a change of vigor and probably energy which was put into the policy under Prime Minister Modi. And to a very large extent, perhaps it was an effort by Prime Minister Modi to own the policy. He did not want to take it as a policy which had started earlier and he was running the same. Therefore, the name change did all these things. And, Mr. Modi also changed the name of neighborhood approach. He first called it neighborhood first. Not that neighbors were not on priority on India's foreign policy, but he called it a different name. And similarly here also. There are many explanations you will find officially which are being given, that there is a great deal of more emphasis on economics, there is a great deal of more emphasis on security and defense matters, there is a great deal of more emphasis on countries other than ASEAN so far as this region is concerned, and therefore we call it, and there is more emphasis now on Northeast. All this is correct, but if you find time to go through the pages, we have tried to show that all these initiatives existed earlier also in the Look East policy. They were nothing de novo as it is, but the style of projecting them has definitely changed, and to that extent one can say that this name is justified. But so far as the substantial components of the policy are concerned, they remain the same. I just, in addition, want to comment on what Ambassador Kesavapany has very rightly said, that there was a benign neglect and there was some sort of a misunderstanding on the part of India. Yes, India took ASEAN as a part of creation by the Cold War dynamics, rightly or wrongly. And therefore it injected prejudices in the minds of, as Ambassador Pillai said, Krishna Menon or others which were there. Similarly, the first group of ASEAN took India as being part of the other camp. And therefore, that's why I said, I mean, it is, we can sit down and blame each other. I have a feeling that the roots of all this misunderstanding lay in the dynamics of global politics or Asian dynamics at that time, with a heavy input of the Cold War, the way it was being run. And that's why Narasimha Rao could take the initiative which he took, but immediately after the end of the Cold War. Mind it, not during Cold War, because we have given some evidence to show that Indira Gandhi was interested in joining ASEAN from the beginning, but not the kind of ASEAN which was being conceived at that time. So yes, there were differences, not on those parameters. We even, the two sides agreed with each other way back in 1980-82, when India was invited to be a part of ASEAN, full dialogue partner, no sectoral dialogue partner which is started later, but the Cambodian issue vitiated the whole matter. And Cambodian issue again was deeply rooted or influenced or shaped by Cold War dynamics in one way or the other. So that's author's view, put it this way. Throw it in the dustbin if it is not relevant. But that's how we thought, and that's what we have tried to project.
You see, sometimes the certain measures that you take, the timing is very important. At the time when Cambodia was almost invaded, and the whole of ASEAN was, furious about it, and were battling to keep the seat empty at the United Nations for Cambodia. India promoted its representation in Cambodia to a full minister. It used to be Charge, and this upset the Southeast Asian countries, because they felt that this was a slap in the face to say that we don't care what you do, we are going to act in this fashion. So these things do matter. But I find that the foreign policy implementation has, I would say, improved a great deal. The people they send, just taking Singapore, the ones that we get now, the representatives that we get now, I shouldn't say one, the representatives we get now are much better educated in the history of the region, educated in the sense the economic potential of the countries, which was not the case before. I remember one representative, High Commissioner, was very comfortable in his native language, but not so comfortable in the English language. And you can't send somebody out that sort of, unless you don't care what comes out of it. The quality of the improvement that we see now is visible not only in Southeast Asia, but in the Middle East. I see the way India is treated by the Arab countries, the way Israel, Netanyahu goes to the airport in his private car to pick up Modi, Prime Minister Modi, are signals of vast improvement in India's ability to profile itself in a different situation. Not like in the old days, you just, they are Jews, we leave them alone, we don't bother with them, sort of thing. Yeah? So I think there has been great improvements, but with Southeast Asia, I think there is still some room for taking it at a higher level. Okay, next question. Yes, the gentleman at the back. Nobody. Oh, yeah, that number.
Several months ago in January, I attended a conference in Assam on cultural production in the Northeast. And I was very interested to find there that they were interested in researching cultural connectivities between the Northeast and Southeast Asia. Since coming to Singapore, I've been struck by some of the cultural connectivities in terms of Buddhism, in terms of linguistics, and as was mentioned before, there's also a demographic connectivity. In terms of the Act East policy and in terms of the many different connectivities that exist between Southeast Asia and India, are there any connectivities that are more likely that the Indian government will act upon to create a more substantive relationship with ASEAN?
I'm not sure who can speak on behalf of the Indian government. Pani? Yeah, okay.
One of the tragedies of recent years was the failure of the Nalanda University. The Nalanda University was set up to promote precisely what you have been talking about, interconnectivity across Buddhism, across Hinduism, across Islam, across Christianity. Because all these four religions, four cultures intersect in Southeast Asia. So there was great hope that Nalanda would be a launch pad for these kind of research and activities. Unfortunately, it didn't do that. Singapore was prepared to even set up contribute towards a library of $10 million. But somehow the political, I don't know what word to use, stood in the way, and that dream has rather diminished. And so it's a shame, because Nalanda would have been India's answer to the belt that the Chinese are promoting in the cultural sphere. We could have had a great cultural belt stretching right from Afghanistan right down to Myanmar, Bali. And this is what we were promoting, and it didn't happen. Or it has not happened.
I would just add, I think the example of Nalanda University, I would say don't depend on the governments to promote cultural connectivity. I think if there is a general question of state competence or sometimes state interference, that it is the cultural contacts are expanding between India and the region in spite of the government. So while a government-driven Nalanda University has been a failure, but today you see a lot more engagement that is taking place at a non-governmental level. I mean, not just limited to Southeast Asia, the Korean, theater, Korean movies, K-pop, hugely popular in the Northeast. The historic cultural links between the different groups of ethnicities in Northeast, to linkage to Thailand, to China, Yunnan, there is a large number of overlap. So these things will express themselves. I mean, as as Chairman Pillai talked about the boy in Indonesian beach, willing to dance an Indian song.
Kabhi Kabhi.
Yeah, okay. It is that level of engagement where actually things are happening. So the question, I think the problem for Delhi is this: can the state facilitate this? But the part of the problem has been it is still a closed structure. Its ability to direct and do things is fairly limited in spite of all the talk about a soft power. But if it just actually steps out of the way and makes it easier for cultural contact, I would say a lot more would happen in the days ahead, whether with government support or even without it. I think the logic where a globalization of culture that is taking place, so I think it is inevitable that more will happen.
Well, I can add a lot on culture, and we can go on talking until the cows come home on culture. But let me share a couple of things, and very frankly, I am not a government man, so I must be. I mean, I agree with Raja that the government alone cannot promote it unless people are really inspired about it. But the government sometimes does things which in fact slows down that movement and obstructs it. And I give you a couple of examples, which are I was appointed ambassador to Laos in 1997. And I was told that Lao culture is very close to Northeast culture. The way they live, the way they eat, the way they do their things. And therefore, my Bharat Darshan, there is a requirement for any new ambassador to go all over India and see what we can project outside. So my Bharat Darshan would be confined to Northeast. I was given in writing that you will have to go to the Northeast, and I'm waiting till today if the government can take me to Northeast. I have come back from that. First example. Therefore, this is how the governments do things. Secondly, and that again is important, and this is no official secret. When I was working in Laos, I got a letter from the culture minister, Dr. Murli Manor Joshi, that Ramayana is played in Southeast Asia in different contexts, and there are many artifacts of Ramayana which are different from one region to another, and we are collecting those artifacts in order to link them up and see how our culture goes on. So please collect those artifacts. So we as embassy started running around and did few things and located people, that those who can give the artifacts. Wherever we went, they said, how you are going to compensate if we give you this artifact which belongs to us. I wrote back to the culture ministry and there is no answer to that till date. I'll give you third example. In Laos, I went down to south. Suvarnakhet is a place where they have taken many of the archaeological ruins of Hindu temples and Buddhist temples, and there is a big room in which they had just dumped it and said, we want to have a museum of these Indian artifacts. And I wrote to the ministries, Survey of India. Survey of India sent a man there. After a lot of efforts, about 8-9 months efforts, they came. He went there to survey and that report did not come until I left the Laos. But later on, after 7-8 years, somebody did something and this happened. This is how it slows down. And in the present context, since there is a reference, sir, it's not only Bollywood. I mean, and I must say that Prime Minister Modi has energized the civilizational component of Act East policy very, very strongly. But a footnote of a caution. In that energization, there is a great deal of emphasis on Hinduism and Buddhism. And these two are emphasized openly. I have minister's statement, somewhere I have quoted, somewhere I can refer it to you, in which they said, because Hinduism and Buddhism were born in India, and from India they went abroad, so that's what we are emphasizing. And I have a puzzle here. and I may be naive or I may be totally wrong, that why not the Indian culture, as we understand in India, is a composite culture, which gets all the religions, including Islam, very much integrated. I mean, those who have studied Islam in India will tell you, India has added a lot to Islam through two major theological schools of Deoband and Barelvi, and even otherwise. In fact, the character of Islam from India to Southeast Asia is much softer than on the Western side. There is a lot of Wahhabism and violence which has crept in, which is not there. And that's why the Islam in Southeast Asia happily coexists with all other religions. Now, why are we disowning Islam? I don't understand. And officially disowning Islam. And I have a running debate with people who are managing, and they foo-foo what I am saying. But by not doing it, or by doing it less, it's not totally out. I mean, there are mosques which Prime Minister Modi sometimes visits. There are conferences on Sufism which Prime Minister Modi has addressed. But on the overall thrust of the policy, Islam does not figure out. And by doing so, and I've talked to the ambassadors of these countries, there are at least 4 to 5 Islamic countries in Southeast Asia. There are 4 of India's immediate neighbors who are Islamic. So what are we doing? I mean, if even when we are running a cultural policy, why not have the composite culture, besides the songs, besides the dances, besides the artifacts, various other things? Why not we project a composite culture? And I go a step ahead and say, this is the time when the softer version of Islam has to be assertively projected all over the world in order to fight with the more radicalized version of Islam, ideologically and theologically. And therefore, India and countries like Indonesia have a great responsibility to come forward, Malaysia also, come forward and join this front and do it together if the two sides can do it. But as I said, we can continue to talk on culture till the cows come back home.
Too many cows.
Yes, 3 hands, 2 hands. Yeah.
3 hands.
This is 3.
Professor Muni, I hope your book has dealt with the issue of India always projecting itself as a big brother. India always projecting itself as a big brother. Big brother. Bigger than whatever. And that brings me to the point which Mr. Kesavapany made, that on the Republic Day, all 10 Prime Ministers of ASEAN were invited. There was one school of thought that did India consider all 10 ASEAN countries equal to India? Was that a proper respect to all the Prime Ministers of ASEAN to call them all together in one Republic Day parade? Something to think about.
I think look, I don't think any ASEAN country said, look, that's a dishonor to invite all the 10 of them together. Today, I think it's fairly common. ASEAN itself, for example, ASEAN defense ministers have a regular meeting with the Chinese defense minister. The ASEAN defense ministers have had a round of consultations with the US defense people. President Obama, I think, hosted an ASEAN summit. ASEAN itself structurally has a +1 kind of concept where all of them sit together with their major partner countries. So I don't think that is the issue. The issue is the big brother attitude. That is, I think, historically, there was a sense that Indians were too condescending, too, what Ambassador Pani said, look, dismissing others as cola republics or whatever it is. That, I think, I would say India has learnt its lesson, of that it is going to somehow lead Asia. That was the imagination in the 50s, to one where it is now the whole strategy is to catch up with East Asia and Southeast Asia. So I think we passed that phase. There was a period in which India had that problem. Today, 91, when the fortunes was reversed, that is, India had to catch up. We used ASEAN as a model, as a template on which India's economic liberalization could take place. Even today, for all our difficulties, we say, look, our benchmark on tariffs is ASEAN. So I think it's really more of emulating ASEAN today rather than trying to be a big brother. I mean, that phase was there, that is gone long ago.
Yeah. You have to.
I don't think we ever had ASEAN ever had an idea that India would be big brother. Because at that time, India was not in a position to play big brother to anybody. You know, it was making its own way in the world, and we were making our own way in the world. So how could you be a big brother? Our big brother then was the United States. Because without the United States, we would have become swept by communism. That was our big worry. Our big worry was China. China would have been our big brother. But India, no way did we think that India would be big brother. In the cultural context, some of us would have felt. But as you said, with Islam coming in, the cultural component became mixed. It was not a Hindu-Buddhist culture any longer. It was Islamic, it was Christian culture. So that's why the concept that India was a big brother, like what Majumdar said, the greater India. Yes. But everybody dismissed that. Nilakanta Shastri's was a better definition of the relationship between India and Southeast Asia, where it was a composite kind of relationship.
Yeah, I had a couple of words. On, Big Brother is not an Oriental expression. Big Brother is a typical American expression. The Oriental expression is elder brother. And that makes a world of difference in terms of, connoting what you really. Big Brother is the guy who sits with 50 television sets to watch you, what you are doing, and then come and tell you, don't do this. Elder brother is the one who will come and slap you if he sees that you are committing a mistake, but also will run to your assistance as and when you need him or her. These are different concepts. We have unfortunately read so much of the Western literature that we have imbibed those concepts and we sit to analyze it. I fully endorse Ambassador Kesavapany and Dr. Raja Mohan's comments on the big brother issue so far as Southeast Asia is concerned. If at all, the big brother is for India's immediate neighbors. And that first came from the West. Immediate neighbors have always felt that India is a big brother. Now, I give you one small instance of Nehru's dealings with Sukarno. Nehru had the Asian countries being dealt as family. Asia for Asians is not Xi Jinping's phrase. Asia for Asian was first of all a Nehru's phrase. And he dealt with Asia as the Asian neighbors as it is. And in this Asian neighborhood, so far as he thought he was very close to Sukarno. And when Bandung conference was being organized, and I have told this to chairman earlier, that Nehru would interfere with micromanagement to the extent of writing to the Indonesians saying that what kind of toilets you should make for the foreigners who are coming, which irritated the Indonesians, and I would say rightly so, because it gave an impression as if Indonesians did not know how to run a conference or an international conference, and that Bandung, in fact, was the first and the last Afro-Asian conference, because the break between India and Indonesia started then, did not come in 65. It started, and then Sukarno started leaning more towards China for ideological or domestic reasons or whatever else it is. Therefore, this Indian style of working as a family and therefore dominating in the sense of elder brother, if at all you want to use that, was not very palatable with a family which has all the sovereign states. There's a lot of, and I don't know, Raja, if we have learned those lessons even now. To some extent, yes, we are cautious about it, but there is a great deal of problem in dealing with it. Even now, I see when our friends come from Nepal and Bhutan, for instance, many people say, you are like us. No, they don't think they are like you. On their part, there is a whole question of identity of a sovereign state, not identity of a cultural people. And we in India commit this blunder of mixing up cultural identity with the sovereign identity. You're dealing with sovereign entities, and I think India has to be a great deal more cautious. But I reiterate the point made by Ambassador Kesavapany, that there was absolutely no feeling of big brother so far as India and Southeast Asia was concerned. It was a feeling between the immediate neighbors.
Yes. The lady in front?
Thank you, Professor Muni. I was just wondering whether your book discusses the issue of whether there are stakeholders in the Northeast. So the Northeast India has traditionally sort of been planned for, there have been policies planned for the region by Delhi, often without the involvement of the stakeholders themselves. And I'm wondering, has that changed in recent years, and to what extent? Because like you said, given the cultural affinities, it would then make sense to have more of these people from this region involved in this particular type of policy making. So that was the question that I had in mind. Just given the fact that, like, having lived in the Northeast, I do know that there are questions of whether they identify entirely as mainland Indians. So there is sort of this question of a ruptured identity, and earlier there would be sort of the feeling that people in the Northeast felt closer to, say, China or the West rather than India. And how do you see that has changed in recent years?
Well, I think it's a very valid and very sensitive and interesting question, I must say. That so far as Northeast identity is concerned, there is no doubt that under Act East policy, Prime Minister Modi's establishment has paid a lot of attention to Northeast. And Northeast was integrated even earlier. I would recall Mani Shankar Iyer, when he was the Minister of Northeast. He had a lot of projects of energy connectivity and various other connectivities, which unfortunately in a democratic India was shot down by the MEA. So it did not work, did not proceed further. But the idea of connectivity and linkages were already there. Now that there is a lot of emphasis, there is a lot of money which is going into connectivity projects of roads which have been hanging for years together, and which I call delivery deficit, is a characteristic feature of India's foreign policy. And sir, besides emphasizing culture, if India does not correct its delivery deficit, it will not make friends anywhere. Not only in Southeast Asia, anywhere there is a problem. Therefore, whatever we promise, we must deliver on time to the satisfaction of the targeted society or the targeted country. Therefore, even now, I have been going and meeting Northeast some people, the chief ministers and the governors are being invited into the conferences, but not in the shaping of the Act East policy. Therefore, your basic question is stakeholders of the Northeast, to how much they feel identified with the policy. There is a better atmosphere than what it was before Mr. Modi, but the problem has not been solved. It is true that Sushma Swaraj called a meeting of the governors of Northeast. Sushma Swaraj also called a meeting of the chief ministers of the Northeast to tell them what their priorities were, and she took on the priorities. But you know, when these 10 ASEAN countries prime ministers came there and the Indo-ASEAN declaration was there, there is hardly a mention of the Northeast and priorities. Therefore, Northeast still feels that in terms of the core issues of shaping the policy, that their interests are now being taken on the board, no doubt about it, but they don't have a say as to this is how you should proceed, this should be the priority, this should be the allocation.
Can I add?
Yes.
I think this is one area where India and ASEAN can make a difference if we work together. Because ASEAN is very interested in connectivity, connecting Northeast to the rest of Asia. Then we form a contiguous part right down to Singapore. But it has been more words than deeds. They have had the motor car races and this, that, and all. But unless real infrastructure development takes place, it will not happen. It will just be the times when Subhash Chandra Bose's army tried to enter India through that route. And this is an area that should be worked on by policymakers. But unfortunately, policymakers are quickly distracted by a number of other issues. So there we are.
Yes, the gentleman at the back, yes.
Thank you. My name is Ankush from ISAS. I've not had the pleasure of reading the book yet, but I'm looking forward to it. I would like to touch on a topic, or a term rather, which is likely to be in the book, which is this concept of the Indo-Pacific. And it's a term that's got a lot of traction right now, especially between India and ASEAN. And there's a lot of talk, with these buzzwords of ASEAN centrality and inclusivity and all these things, but much less certainty about how the concept plays out or how it's viewed by different people. But at the very least, there is, I think, some intent. I think just 2 days ago, the Indian Ministry of External Affairs has created a Indo-Pacific wing now. So if I could get Professor Muni and perhaps Ambassador Kesavapany to give the Indian and Southeast Asian kind of prognosis on this concept and what you think, how it will develop, if it will develop at all. Thank you.
Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific.
Indo-Pacific.
Yeah. So maybe you can start.
Indo-Pacific was a ball that was given to India to run because it was opening up, it was strengthening its naval facilities. I've been one of those who in continuously saying India must strengthen its naval capability. Otherwise, you would not be taken seriously. Until and unless that happens, India will be a side player. And what has happened is the US has taken over this very concept and is now running with the ball. Not for any other reason but to confront or to balance China. China, which has opened up a base in Djibouti. See the reach that China has had. But India is still, in the shallow water, so to speak. So unless its strategic potential, its defense potential is strengthened, I think it will not be a frontline player. That's my view.
Yeah. In the case of China, China always had a global view of itself. The voyages of Cheng Ho, for instance, he set up a station in Calicut during the 1,000-year celebration. I was asked to go and see whether the Kerala government will open up this particular facility to public so that we can add it to the map that we were focusing. Of course, they were not interested. They didn't think that that many Chinese tourists are going to go to Calicut just to see this thing. But China had, until it closed all its gates and decided not to be a maritime nation, but it did have aspirations of that in the very early times. One other point I like to make is to go back to culture. Professor Muni said that Singapore is the only country that had an institute to study South Asia. Singapore is also the only country that has got an Indian Heritage Center. There's not a single one anywhere in this part of the world. And even though it's called Indian Heritage Center, it is very much the India that was from Afghanistan to Myanmar, the India that was undivided, the ancient India. And one of the features of this center, the most expensive artifact there is the gate of a mosque from Multan. It cost us a packet, and there was a lot of debate on this. Mr. Pani will be able to back me up on this, that people felt that why are we spending so much on a very minority of a minority, we should be more open to. But we insisted that that gave it a character, that we are taking the total scene to and be represented in this heritage center. And subsequent visitors, we find that we have Malay heritage, we have a Chinese, we have an Indian. The one that is best visited, the highest number of people visiting, is the Indian one. And among them, the highest number are tourists from China. It's a fantastic scene. If you go to, particularly weekends, you see so many people in that place. So culture, I still feel, has got done properly. I think the point made by Professor Muni is correct. A lot of it dissipates if you don't implement it properly. But you do it well, I think it has got a tremendous and a lasting impression on the other side. Yeah. Sorry, it's the gentleman.
Asked specifically to...
No, after Mr. Indo-Pacific is your cup of tea.
No, maybe some of the things I say will provoke Professor Muni also, which is, I think the Indo-Pacific idea does 2-3 things. I mean, I think one, by putting Indo into the Pacific, it's actually about saying that India is going to be important for the balance of power in this part of the world. Now, it doesn't matter how many times I might say it, but when Americans say it, it's a different context. So I think what you're seeing is by arguing that, or by demonstrating that India's importance for the larger balance of power in the region, you change the way the security debate has been conducted in this region for decades. Second, it also reflects India's drawing closer to the Americans. If the Cold War that Professor Muni talked about was about distancing between India and the US, India became closer to the Soviet Union, which created in turn problems with the region. Today in India, that draws closer to the US, you want the Quad, the Triad, which we do with the Japanese, the Quad, which the Australians are included. Essentially, while India is still not fully in, the prospects of India working with the West, the prospect that India is a de facto ally of the United States in securing this region is a fundamental break from the traditional framing of how India's role in this part of the world is. Of course, in India, of course, there is an argument, are we non-aligned or not, are we aligned? That debate will go on, but the fact is, India has never worked with the Americans as closely as it does today under the Indo-Pacific framework. So that is a historic change that has taken place. And in some ways, this is actually a return to the colonial period, which next time you do the book on India and Southeast Asia, I think it's worth looking at the colonial period, which many of us tend to take it out. I mean, you talk about the Antiquity, but I think much of the modern engagement between India and Southeast Asia must be treated to colonial period. In fact, today Singapore is celebrating 200th anniversary. It was a civil servant of the East India Company who came here and set up this place. Of course, Singapore is now looking back to its own 700 years. But the fact is, till 1867, Malaya, Singapore were part of India, United India. Burma was part of India till 1935, 1937. So if you go to the colonial period, actually, I would think it would tell you a lot more about what is possible between the two regions. Connectivity was very high. Indian capital and labor moved across what we now call Indo-Pacific, is largely the same thing, which is from Suez to Hong Kong. You look at Indian capital moved, Indian labor moved. So in some sense, India's centrality in organizing the globalized structure was quite evident in the colonial period. Now, what happened afterwards? India pulled back. Now, I'm not saying it's good or bad. From security, we said, look, we're not going to be part of it. In fact, there was a reference to SEATO a little earlier. The formation of SEATO, the formation of CENTO, the formation of five-power defense arrangement, all were a consequence of India's refusal to be part of a security structure that is aligned to the West. It's not that every ASEAN country joined. I mean, only Thailand and Philippines were there. Indonesia was neutral. But the fact is, India pulled out on the security structure. Second, India also pulled out of globalization. That these two important factors, India's inward economic orientation and India's non-aligned security positions, largely disconnected India from what was happening in the region. Now, you can say that's good or bad. That's our historical legacy. in some senses today, India re-globalization connects it much closer to Southeast Asia. India's alignment, if you will, or engagement, or collaboration, cooperation with the US and Japan puts it back into the security picture in a far more central way. Now, not every ASEAN member is comfortable with it, because many of them fear the Quad is a problem. Some people like it, some people don't like it. Indonesia has its own concept of Indo-Pacific. But what it has changed is the nature of the discourse. Now, India is going to be part of this one way or another. So that actually sets us on a very different template of how India is going to relate to the countries of the region. That, I think, whether everyone agrees with it or not, is going to open up a lot more space for engagement on economic, on security between India and Southeast Asia. You have enough meat to hit back, sir?
Yes, yes. You deliberately did that, I think so. But I must confess to you that I agree with all your explanations, except on the nature of, not the nature, I'll come to it in a while. First on Indo-Pacific, I think both Ambassador Kesavapany and Raja Mohan have very rightly hit the nail that this is, in the present context, is a strategic concept. And therefore, it relates largely to the maritime issues in terms of security of the region and all that which is happening, which has already been explained. I, in fact, tend to go with both of them, plus what Ambassador Pillai has said, that for India, and I was debating with a lot of foreign policy makers in India, as to why India was hesitant in the beginning to get into the Indo-Pacific concept. And Raja would bear me out that initially when the concept came, India did not know whether to join or not join. Because India also took that concept entirely in the security context and was hesitating, and even now hesitating, to what extent we should link up with the US so far as security matters in the region are concerned. How close is not too close is still an issue before Indian foreign policy. And therefore you see this hesitation. But if you add culture, as Ambassador Pillai has very rightly underlined, and I'll give you some of the instances there, I mean, there's absolutely no reason. India should have not only jumped at the concept, India should have initiated the concept. I go to this extent. Because India has had long, deep roots into the region for all these, that's why the reference to antiquity. And including colonial period. We have devoted almost 5, 10, 15 pages on the colonial period. That what the colonial period did was to introduce Indian input into the region in terms of plantation economy, in terms of diaspora, and in terms of maritime security, with the Indian soldiers guarding as far as Hong Kong and going up. You know, this was all part. And then Subhash Bose, and we have referred to him also. Therefore, colonial period was important. I fully agree with you. My problem with Raja is only, and that he does deliberately in order to make us debate with each other. He brings in Indo-US questions. And I have repeatedly quoted it. I quote you 1949. Nehru's first official visit is to the United States of America. In that very first visit, when he did, he was communicating with Krishna Menon, yes, who was not very favorable to the United States of America. And he wrote a letter to Krishna Menon. And I want to underline it to tell you with what mindset Nehru went to the US. And he writes, Krishna, and I'm quoting word for word, Krishna, why not we align ourselves somewhat with the US to build up our economic, scientific, and military capabilities, unquote. Now, this is the mindset with which Nehru goes there. And Nehru thought he would be, maybe he was a megalomaniac. You can call him by any names, which many of the American scholars call him these days, that he was only an ideologue, he did not know realism at all. There are so many things which are being said. But Nehru went with this mindset to the United States of America. And he found that he was not being treated on a level which would give him respect. And that's why the alliance did not come up. India worked very closely with Suez crisis. on Suez crisis against the French and the British with the Americans. The year is 1958. The Indians leaned towards the Soviet Union after 53-54. We were independent in 47. 47 to 54 are 7 long years. India had nothing to do with the Soviet Union. India's first arms purchases went to the French, not the Soviets. The first arms purchases with the Soviet came in 62, not before that, despite the Khrushchev and other visits and a lot of halla-bulla which was created about it. Therefore, my contention is that India always wanted to be close with the United States of America, but hang on, now you had your say. But it wanted the kind of level, it did not want to be treated, and Nehru said it very clearly in the United States of America, that I can't be a Turkey or a Greece for you. So you just join the alliance and then we work together. Sorry, that's not the way. India thought, right, wrong, whatever else it is. But there was no reservation. I underline, and for Raja particularly, no reservation on working strategically with the United States of America. The problem was with the terms of engagement. And this nuance, I have talked to Ashley Tellis one day, is not being underlined by many of those of US started respecting India, maybe some difference of opinion there in my mind, after 1998 when India exploded nuclear device. Not before that. Not before that strategically. Despite Reagan's best effort and Mrs. Gandhi's effort to go to Reagan and said, okay, let us have a strategic relationship. He had even in principle agreed to give arms, certain kind of arms to India, and even technology was to be talked about it. It did not come through because Pentagon and State Department were not willing for this. Therefore, if you have a critical examination, it is absolutely unfair, to say the least, to blame India, and let me underline India alone for that matter, if the US-India relationship did not come through. Non-alignment word is not India's word. It was much later. Non-aligned movement was not initiated by India. India joined it in order to aggregate the power of the powerless, rightly or wrongly, whatever it happened. But the earlier part was, why not we somewhat align with the US? Now that alliance did not come through, and it did not come through because of the terms of engagement which were unilaterally defined by the US. Thank you.
Professor Muni, may I ask a question? India's relationship with the United States started to improve almost simultaneously with India's relationship with Israel. Which came first? Did Israel relationship lead the way, or was it the other way around?
I'm not quite an expert on Israel. Maybe Raja will throw more light on it. But I think it started much earlier. Israel, there was no problem even in Nehru's mind, I would say. The problem was that the Indian leadership under Nehru and later on Mrs. Gandhi did not want to take a step in which the Muslim world got alienated. So this was a huge hesitation, and therefore they went through very, very cautiously. But relationship with India Israel started building much before even Atal Bihari Vajpayee started that, and therefore the UPA period. But there were always hesitation. And
I thought Advani's visit to Israel at that time.
Yes, the Atal Bihari Vajpayee's time it started it, but even Nehru's time somebody visited there. I'm forgetting the name, but as I said, I am not at my hand so far as Israel relationships dates are concerned.
No, India was one of the first countries to recognize Israel as a country.
Yes.
So they established diplomatic relations right immediately after Israel was formed in 48. But what it did not do was to establish full-scale diplomatic relations.
Yes,
That is,
yes.
there was no ambassador. In fact, Israelis have had a consulate in India. India did a lot of work with them in,
That was
moving
in
the
Bombay.
Jewish, in Bombay, yeah. In moving, the Jewish people to Israel. So there was actually an engagement. Things started falling apart because, as I said, Nehru was constantly in touch with them. It's post-67 Arab-Israeli war, when India's desire to be seen as being with the Arabs actually, and joining them in boycotts, in downgrading relationship, and a whole lot of things. So it's post-67, India's non-aligned attempt at being one of the non-aligned actually downgraded the relationship. But when the Janata government came to power in 77, they were against this policy. So one of the first things they did was to have Moshe Dayan come to Delhi. It was a secret visit, of course, like nothing stays secret in India. So that got leaked. There was a huge controversy. That time Vajpayee was the foreign minister. So often then you have the 91, when the new government comes, this time it is the Congress party which takes the lead. And by the time the Israeli-Arab peace process had started, so the 91 onwards were actually, so it, in a sense it precedes. And that had less to do with the global situation as much as the domestic Islamic question and the other issues.
It was not moving in tandem, as it
No.
Okay.
But it's useful, I mean,
it might
to
have
have...
reinforced each other.
Okay.
It might have reinforced each other.
I think we have time. Sorry. Yeah.
Prof, your comment on US-India relations. Was the US looking for a yes or no answer? Were you with me or you're not with me? If you're not with me, then, the ballgame is different.
That's true. That's precisely the position. Secondly, I think the US was actually following, and I don't blame US much more, I blame British much more, because the Cold War actually was planned by a joint committee of the US and the British, and the US knew nothing about Asia. The British claimed that they knew much about Asia, and they were the one who were guiding that Cold War shaping. And in the whole idea of Cold War shaping, when India's partition took place, again, let us not go into that history, that after partition, the dominant powers of the post-Cold War scene wanted to use both Indian and Pakistani military resources to manage Asia. Therefore, they would have preferred India to be an ally which followed the terms given to them. Unfortunately, India was not willing for that. And India was not willing to be treated either as equal to Pakistan or as Greece or as Turkey or whatever else it is. It doesn't mean, and this is being wrongly interpreted by most of the American scholars, it doesn't mean that India was reluctant to work with the US. I would say, go to the extent of saying, it was the US reluctance which literally forced India into the Soviet lap, if at all you want to use it that way. Well, I think we will wait for the history to correct this perception, which is very widespread, which has affected India's relationship with Southeast Asia. And I'm afraid not many in Southeast Asia have gone to this extent to see what actually which disturbed it in one way or the other. And most of the issues on which we were divided actually were the legacy of the Cold War, including, sir, with due apologies, Cambodia.
Yes.
Because in Cambodia, again, for the first time, we saw China and the US joining hands in favor of Khmer Rouge. I mean, on what basis it can be justified? But it happened. This is a part of history. This is how it has unfolded itself.
I just want to add that I think this ignores the economic dimension. If it is not just security.
India ignored.
No, that's fine. I'm just that India would not join alliances was quite clear. But India also chose the socialist path, which was economic self-reliance, the Bombay Plan, the attempt at constructing a different type of economy. And then the case for economic engagement steadily declined. And that's what happened with Southeast Asia as well, that in India that closed its economy had less, I mean, if you had security, if you had problems, you could have still compensated somewhat with the economic thing. So simultaneous, both retrenchment and, on the economic side as well as on the security side, produced a situation where you could not manage it. And then it did not end with Nehru. 19 Janata government throwing out IBM out of India. Can you believe it? I mean, that was the culture that threw out IBM from India. Coca-Cola, I can understand you want to make your own stupid drink, which nobody wants to drink these days, but to throw out IBM in 1977, I mean, it tells you the mindset by where India's economic policies had moved to a point where its ability to relate to the Western world or the capitalist world, if you will, declined. And I think it was the period exactly when Southeast Asia changed course, and that in turn reduced the interface of possible interfaces with South. But anyway, that's all history. But I think today, I mean, I'll just conclude by saying that, look, just this month we have the reports of India's total trade figures of last year, that is still March. India's exports for the first time crossed $500 million, that's $500 billion. The total commodity trade is now just below $1 trillion. Total commodity trade of India is now $1 trillion. If you add services to it, it's about $1.2 trillion. Now, this is a huge change from India of the past, irrespective of what happened in the past. Today, an economy of $3 trillion, out of which $1.2 trillion is the external exposure. This is a fundamentally different India today. Therefore, how it relates its economic body to the rest of the world is going to be very, very different. I think that is what gives me the structural optimism that over the longer term, that this structure, this is exposed, globalized, related to the rest of the world, in which technology plays a role. ASEAN has become a major innovation center. That again is an area that ISAS will hope to work. So I think there are forces that are driving us together, irrespective of what happened in the past. While postmortems are important, it's also the future which will bring us together.
And this is what Lee Kuan Yew wanted you to do.
No, but I have a slightly different take on economy, but I will not bore you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this thing. I was hoping to have one more question, but this time, can we make it very brief? Yes.
Yes, but I have a question. Perhaps some of you can be wondering why very far west, southwest to India is participating in this debate. Indeed, a presentation of this very interesting book. Well, first of all, because I am personally interested in the historical and cultural links between Southeast Asia and China and India. And secondly, because the relationships between Peru, in spite of distance, between Peru and India have been reinforced significantly in the last few years. In the first years of our bilateral relationships, in the 60s and 70s, the relation with India was of a political nature, mainly. We participated very actively with India in the non-aligned movement and in the Group of 77 at the level of the United Nations system and all the organizations of the system. In the 80s, we experienced a sort of transitional period in terms of our bilateral links, but from the 90s on, there was a sort of impetus in terms of economic links, up to the point that today, India is the fifth, in spite of distance, is the fifth trade partner of Peru. We are exporting tons of gold, for example, to India. No? And up to the point that we are engaged in very active negotiations with India.
Gold is a dead asset.
Yes, I know. With India to have a free trade agreement. I know that Indians are very tough negotiators. No, the negotiations have been very long, but we are optimistic in the sense that perhaps we are going to conclude these negotiations this year. Peru would be the first or the second Latin American country to have a free trade agreement with India, and we are participating very actively in the CPTPP negotiations. Well, we are a party of the CPTPP negotiations, and for that reason we are very interested in knowing, and this is my question, knowing what is, in your opinion, the possibility for these RCEP negotiations to be concluded this year? I know that these 16 countries that are...
I mentioned that it seems to be not in the line of vision at the moment. 6 years, 33 meetings, but nothing much has happened, and nothing much may happen in the near future.
Okay.
There doesn't seem to be any definite line given, even though India says it's still negotiating.
Okay.
But India takes a lot of pleasure in being the spoiler rather than the achiever.
Okay, you think that it's not going to be possible?
I won't say that. There are experts there.
No experts. Official Indian position is that RCEP will be signed by the end of this year. This is official statement. This is official statement. Don't attribute it to me.
I think that's a good time to end. Let me thank the panelists. First, thank the author. I think the book does stimulate quite a lot of discussion, and we could sit the whole evening talking about it because there's so many aspects to it. We haven't really penetrated into the book, because originally the idea was each of the panelists will say their take on the book, and then we ask questions. I skipped that part of it, and maybe I did a disservice to Professor Muni, but I think we will have his new other books. He's got a whole list, he told you. So we will make sure that he comes here often and launches a book each time, and we will have a discussion. And he will always generate a discussion and, if possible, an argument. So that's something that we can look forward to. May I also thank all of you for staying and participating. It has been an active session, and I think we have learned quite a bit. And the book is worth reading. Chakmana, I got a copy for you because I've already bought a copy. Not bought a copy, Sitara gave me a copy. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I think tea and biscuits or whatever is being served. Do stay and interact with the panelists and particularly the author. Thank you very much.
May I insert just a commercial which my publisher has asked me to do that, and that is we have distributed flyers on the book, which if you follow that may probably give you 20% discount.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Honored. Thank you very much. Very, very kind. Thank you, Raja.